Welcome to the Trauma Resonance Resilience podcast. And my name's Lisa Cherry, and I'm going to be your host. And as always, I always start off with how excited I am to be here and excited to be able to have a conversation. And that's what this podcast is about. It's always about having conversations that make a difference. And today I have a very special guest, and I'll give you a little clue. It's 9 o'clock in the morning here, and it's 6 o'clock in the evening there. So we are in different countries. So we are with a clinical psychologist who lives and works on Garna, Nurungga, and Nukunu country in the land known as Australia. Across the last 28 years, he has worked continuously with children and young people recovering from a tough start to life, and also the adults who interact with them in care and professional roles. He's got 3 busy psychotherapy clinics, also writes, delivers programs, basically just does loads and loads of stuff like my good self, looks at the awareness of the experience, needs and therapeutic care of young people who've experienced complex childhood trauma, working not just in Australia but also in Ireland. And he's got teams that he works with who support kinship carers of Australian Aboriginal children. He's expanding his work currently with individuals and teams working in the child welfare space. Please welcome Colby Pearce. Hello.
Hello. Good to speak to you.
Don't you find bios really intimidating? Because when people read a bio that I have, I always sort of think, honestly, that's just too much. It just feels too much. Do you feel like that?
I don't always feel comfortable with a bio, and I probably don't include very much information in it, and then kind of think, and then I listen to other people giving and their bios, and I think, I should have mentioned that, or I should have mentioned that. But it's more in my nature to very much to say less than more.
It's really funny you say that, because I'm doing a webinar and I got the bios of some of the people that I'm doing the webinar with, and I just thought, I am so rewriting my bio. I've got to put some more stuff in my bio, because like you, I don't have loads of stuff. So I've done that journey too. So but listen, we've now, it's really interesting to be speaking to you, because we've been connected for quite a few years, and I can't remember how we became connected. Do you remember?
No, I don't. I mean, presumably, I'm thinking that it's via LinkedIn, and I guess a mutual awareness of each other's work. I think the first time that I watched a conversation that you were having was one with Karen Treisman.
Yes.
And I communicated with you both, I think, or at least with you after that. And if memory serves, you were talking the part of that conversation that particularly resonated with me, and this is going back a few years, was really around the experience of working in certain organisations and the impact of that work on us as professional practitioners in this space. So I think that's my memory of when I kind of first reached out and communicated with you.
Yeah.
And I don't know how long ago that was, because this whole COVID thing has just made my perception of time go a bit odd, because there's kind of like life before COVID, and then I call it the great disruptor. Lots of things got disrupted, and but it must have been probably 3 or 4 years ago, I think.
Yeah, maybe even longer. And I think that whole time thing around the pandemic's really interesting, and that idea of, because some of the things it brought to the fore were things that, for those of us who work in certain spaces and places, are very familiar with. It's what we work with. We work with inequity. We work with disparity. But for lots of people, it was the first time they'd kind of got any sense of the place they lived in, really.
Yes, it was it was a very unusual time. I remember I used to write and talk about trauma, community or population prevalence of trauma, and before the pandemic, and most of the available research would say roughly 2/3 of the adult population have experienced trauma in their lifetime. And then along comes the pandemic, and I think it was, whether people fully acknowledged it or not, it had many of the same impacts on us as relational trauma generally does. So what I mean by that is that it really impacted the way the beliefs that people had about themselves and other people and the world in which they are living, that influenced their approach to life and relationships. So it very much, there was the move to, I'm vulnerable, you're dangerous, the world is unsafe, which is, very much reflective of the internal working model of children and young people who have experienced early trauma, particularly relational trauma, complex relational trauma. Everyone was a bit heightened. Our motors were running faster than usual. And we got very concerned about where we were getting our toilet paper from, or at least we did it here in Australia. Toilet paper, flour, what else was, there was a small number of products that, it came to be in very much short supply. So we were very much worried about access to needs provision, how we were going to get our needs met. And I kind of normally fit those under the title of a AAA model: attachment, arousal, and accessibility to needs provision. And that's a model that I developed and have had published, and helps me to understand the experience of trauma.
Yeah, I think lots of people listening will really find that helpful to think about what happened in the pandemic through that lens and in that way, and also the kind of isolation experience, depending on who you had access to, who you didn't have access to, what buffers you had. All of that stuff fits really well within that kind of thinking. And attachment is really your bag, isn't it? I think I came into contact with you before you made contact with me, because I was reading your book on attachment years ago, way before that podcast that you're talking about, and a fascination, of course, with thinking about attachment. And I'm just writing about it at the moment in my PhD, and some of the complexities with the attachment theory and where that's the journey that's taken us to. So what leads a person to have such a deep fascination? This is a slightly rhetorical question, I guess, but what leads a person to have such a deep fascination with attachment, Colby?
Goodness, well, it's probably a case of, now you know I'm a psychotherapist primarily, so it all goes back to childhood, of course.
Of course.
So look, I've always been interested in relationships, and relationships through my own experience growing up were very much front and center in my mind growing up. And I think from an early age, because I had a mixed experience of relationships, so I was evaluating relationships, I guess, from an relatively early age, and probably at an age where I in other circumstances, more conventional circumstances, would have just approached relating to others with basic trust and with an acceptance that relationships were generally a satisfying experience and mutually satisfying. But I reckon I was evaluating relationships from very early on. And then when I was doing my training, I was also doing research in adolescent mental health, and with a particular focus on youth suicide. And I as part of that, I came across Durkheim's work on suicide, and the construct that I probably am butchering, but can't even. I feel like saying anime, you know, like the Japanese cartoons, but Durkheim had a construct that that related to connection and the degree to which a person was embedded in their relational environment. And it was his theorem that those who didn't enjoy close connection were more vulnerable to suicide. And then that progressed as I was going through my postgraduate training to looking specifically at attachment. So attachment became the kind of theoretical basis for me to look more closely at relationships, which I of course took into my work, which has primarily been child welfare for the last 28 years. I've also practiced in family law, courts, intercountry adoption, and in the general community as well. But at all times, I think I've continued to evaluate relationships and had and attachment has provided that theoretical and methodological basis to do that, I guess. And I have and it's just, I guess, sustained my practice all the way through. It's not just attachment, but that's pretty much where it started, was that interested in evaluating relationships and having a lens through which to do that.
And you also work across Australia, which I've spent a little bit of time coming to for the last few years, and Ireland. And I'm really interested in that because we think about, I mean, I've travelled a lot. I'm very lucky. I've travelled a lot, and the trauma experienced everywhere I go has a different historical context to it.
Yes.
And there's something about my experience in Australia. Been coming every couple of years since 2016 for the Childhood Trauma Conference. Yeah, which I love. It's a little bit neuroscience based still, and I'd like it to come to a bit more heart space, but I think it's going to do that in its journey. You know, we're all on a journey with that, aren't we? But there's something, it was really powerful for me. Some of the healing, the Indigenous ways of healing are just so aligned to the same kind of disruptions that being in care brings. There's something really, there's some synergy there. And I think when I was in Victoria, and I think something like 45% of the children who are looked after are Aboriginal children. So there's all sorts of kind of crossovers there that are really interesting to me. And then, of course, we head over to Ireland, and we have this other kind of historical trauma history. And I just wondered if you could nuance some of that a bit in terms of the differences, the similarities, and what that feels like to move around countries doing that work.
Yes, so it's interesting, 2016, I was thinking that might have been when I first went to Ireland, but in fact it was 2015 I went, and I went every year as well, and of course until the pandemic. But I still have programs that are being delivered there, and I'll talk about Ireland a bit more in a moment. The Aboriginal, it's interesting that you raise the experience of Aboriginal people, because Aboriginal people have been very poorly treated in this country since as part of colonisation, and were very much in the, I guess, the perception of a white Australia, you know, a racist lens, were almost a subclass or a subclass within society, and that persists in many respects to this day, where the collective non-Aboriginal view of the worth of Aboriginal people and culture, as probably a little bit as reflected in our recent referendum about an Aboriginal voice to Parliament, which was lost, sadly.
I know.
But
I couldn't believe that at all. I was really shocked, actually.
So it probably reflects the worth that the broader community places on Aboriginal people and Aboriginal culture and Aboriginal history. So we have a choice. We can see Australia as a young country or an old country. And fascinatingly, we seem to prefer to see it as a young country by and large. But what I really want to say about Aboriginal people is that their experience, not only of colonisation, but of the assimilation policies of the white Australia period and before, where children were forcibly removed from their families and lost connection to kin and culture, is trauma. I mean, it is trauma that is not that different from what happens when children are removed from a home that child protection authorities are concerned about, except for the reasons, the justification, you could say. Although there was a perception that the Aboriginal children would be better off being raised in a white culture. But I think the impact on Aboriginal children and who grew into adults of that loss of connection to kin and culture and identity is very significantly important in terms of how we view children who are removed from home because of abuse and neglect, or on grounds of abuse or neglect. That in some ways there is still this mentality that we're saving these children in child protection and child welfare, in the same way that Aboriginal children were being saved. And I think there's a lot where a lot of lessons about the experience of Aboriginal children who were forcibly removed that are directly relevant, I think, to how we think about the experience of children and young people who are in out-of-home care, on grounds of abuse and neglect. And so I think perhaps contrary to what might be the pervasive view, we've got a lot to learn from Aboriginal people and their experience as white non-Aboriginal Australians. We've got a lot to learn about what is the experience of our own children, when in child welfare. But I also think that, and this probably gets to a bit more at what you were suggesting, is that Aboriginal people really remind us of the importance of connection to kin, of connection to family, to knowing where you come from, to knowing who your people are, and I think that's. So from my perspective, they can teach, well, Aboriginal people, I shouldn't call them us and them and use those words, but I think contrary to is probably what is a bit of a pervasive attitude within Australian society and maybe within child welfare as well. But there is a lot we can learn about the way in which Aboriginal people think about child rearing, the way Aboriginal people think about the importance of family and kin and community connection,
and country and nature, and being part of that bigger ecological system. So and it's really good to hear you make some of those parallels, because I've always had a slight anxiety about doing that, because I don't want to detract from one experience for another. I don't, it's a really complex space to do that. And when I first came over in 2016, I was on the plane and I was thinking, you're mad. What are you doing going all the way to Australia to a conference, And I was flicking through the films and I saw this film called The Rabbit-Proof Fence, which you'll be very familiar with. And I wasn't, because you see, education in this country doesn't tell us about our historical being the colonizer. We're not given that narrative, that lens, that understanding. So I knew very little about Australia, actually. And I watched The Rabbit-Proof Fence and I was just like, that's why you're going to Australia for a trauma conference. And I've been kind of hooked in to the learning opportunities ever since. I think, like you say, there's just so much to learn from that experience about, I'm particularly interested in nature, largely because one of the findings around overcoming adversity in my research is about connection to nature, which I thought was really interesting, and even more interesting when we see what is done to nature, and being detached from nature in the way that Indigenous peoples have been made to be. So there's just so many different avenues in there, and I love that you're thinking about that around kinship care and also around relationships and that identity, because belonging, again, is a big passion of mine. That's the piece of work I'm doing at the moment. Where do we come from? Where do we be? What are we attached to?
Where are we meant to be?
Where
do we go where we are meant to be, where we are a person of significance, where we are a person of worth? I think in terms of the development of my thinking, I think it's not the case that everything comes back to attachment or childhood or so on. I think everything comes back to worth, and the self-worth, and the self-worth that we feel from knowing where our place is, knowing our place, knowing our family, knowing our community, knowing our identity. Yeah, the validation that flows from that, and the enhanced sense that I belong somewhere. I'm a person of worth. I have people. I have a place. I have, I have a culture that is mine. That's for me. And I think that was one of the, probably, when Aboriginal people, and look, I'm not an Aboriginal people, and I'm not even an expert really, I think, about the experience of Aboriginal people. But when I speak to Aboriginal people regularly, and what I reflect a lot on was the impact of the loss of culture, and the or connection to culture, and how they internalized the imposition of them of a lack of that being of little worth. That the Aboriginal way and the Aboriginal life and the Aboriginal culture was of little worth, and the white, the culture of the rescuers was greater worth. And I think perhaps people did understand or didn't understand. I suspect not. They didn't really understand what would be the impact of saying of a collective message to a people that your culture is of less worth than our culture. Your people, your land, your community is of less worth.
But also your way of being is of less worth. Our way of being is the way to be.
So I think, so we live in Australia, as do, I guess, what happens in other countries, and there's terrible things happening, as you know, in the Middle East at the moment. But I think we continue, we live, whether we realise it or not, but we live in Australia with the consequences of that trauma that was inflicted, with the best intentions, perhaps.
Have you read My Grandmother's Hands?
I haven't, no.
That is such a fantastic book. It's based in the States, so again, a different historical context. But it really talks about the impact on Black people and white people, which is how it references people, and how Black bodies and white bodies internalize that experience of what happened, of slavery, of being enslaved, and of being the slaver. And very, very interesting to read, which really speaks to what you're just talking about, what that looks like for everybody. It looks very differently for everybody, but it's there. We carry that.
Yep. And sometimes, unfortunately, we defend against it. We avoid it, what we carry responsibility for. And you end up with outcomes like 65% saying no to an Aboriginal voice to Parliament. So I think an Ireland is
let's head over to Ireland.
Yeah. Look, I'm obviously aware of Ireland, but I probably would have to say, well, not even probably, I would say that I do not have the same level of knowledge and understanding, I guess, of the experience of the people in Ireland. I mean, they experience their own colonisation from the English, and they are, and similarly with Aboriginal people, there is the ongoing effects of that experienced by the descendants of both colonizer and those who were there. What I observe about Ireland and with my work in Ireland is the importance of relationship again. And I think whether that comes from, I guess, my approach anyway, which is very much relationship oriented. So I very much focus on relationships and how they work, and again, kind of making assessments of them. But yeah, again, I guess so. In terms of the uptake of my work, probably there's been a number, but the most enduring has been in the TUSLA fostering service in Donegal. So TUSLA being the National Child and Family Agency, and in their fostering service in Donegal, they have rolled out over the 8 years one of my training therapeutic care packages, and then they've subsequently taken on other packages as well. But it's interesting that I think the attraction of it is in part the significant acknowledgement of an emphasis on relationship and relational connection. So I think, that's where that continues to be, I guess, a tremendous privilege for me to have people overseas interested in my work and delivering it. I'm really annoyed that I haven't been able to go back for these last few years to Ireland.
Well, I'm going over there in a couple of weeks. I'm going to be over there. To there's a Unity conference that's you might be familiar with. it's run by, or I'm sure he wouldn't like me saying it's run by him, because I'm sure it takes lots of people to make it happen. But Dr. John Digney, who you probably know because he's from Tussler, and I'm really looking forward to that. And there'll be lots and lots of conversations around different ways of thinking about trauma. But that relational work, I mean, I'm with you on that. That's really one of my passions. I think what I'm really interested in, though, is helping people to unpick what relationship means, because there's this kind of, if you've always had access to relationships, you know, you can go either one of two ways. I really understand, I've always had access to relationships. This is what relationships looks like. What are the aspects of that have made this much easier for me? What do I love about that? What does it give me? Or I've always had access to relationships, the end. I don't have to think about it. I didn't have to build them. I don't have to sustain them. I have lots of family relationships. They just exist. I've never had to unpick that. And then when you start trying to ask people to think about relationships for those who do not have relational wealth, how do you go about building those kind of relationships? And moreover, how do you go about building relationships with people who've had so much disruption and mistrust that actually you're trying to build relationships with someone who is going, you're not coming anywhere near me, we're not having a relationship, you know, which I think Dan Hughes talks about relationship blocks. I can't remember what his terminology is. But
well,
yeah,
blocked care is a term.
That's it, blocked care.
Yeah.
There we go. Yeah. So I think those are the things that are interesting to me in a more kind of macro level, because, you know, when I'm working with a room full of, say, educators, they're not likely to have done much stuff around psychotherapy or necessarily thought about how you build relationships. So that's a piece of work I really like exploring with people, what it means to have that relational wealth and what it means to not have it, you know. But you're asking people then to think about what it might look like to not have relationships, and that's not a nice thing to ask people to think about. You know, they get really uncomfortable about that. So these are kind of ongoing challenges, aren't they, around relational working?
Well, I think it's you're right in that there is a diversity, perhaps, but there is a range of experience that people have of relationships, and that they and although I had never thought about it in this way, it makes perfect sense hearing you talk about it, that there are people who in effect take relationship for granted and don't spend a lot of time thinking about it. And it's hard work getting them to go to that place of thinking about, reflecting on the experience of the person with whom you're trying to have a relationship or needs relational connection as part of their recovery, and their own, the things that the aspects of their approach to relationship that are powerful and important and generally overlooked, that are really significant for the young people in front of you. So I tend to run a bit of a mix of, my preference is always to help people to be, and this is hard. This is actually hard, I think, but I keep at it. I really try very hard to lay out and help people to understand and be able to acknowledge and validate and respond to the experience of the person in front of you, particularly the young person, the child or young person in front of you. And then I try to help people be more in touch with their own ways of being, their own ways of relating, their own ways of interacting that are taken for granted, that are overlooked, that go unacknowledged, but which are also really important and powerful to making connection making a trusting connection, and facilitating new relational experiences for children who need them.
Yeah. Well, we're coming towards the end, and I was thinking, what question can I ask you that we can close on? And I was thinking about, you know, this work is such an honor, isn't it? It's just such a gift. It's such a pleasure. It's such an honor. And it's so much more than work. I mean, it's your life, isn't it? And I wondered what's been the greatest gift that this work, this way of being, this focus, this intensity around trauma and attachment, what has been the greatest gift or gifts that has brought you?
What's many. I think I've been I think it's been in the context of the relationship that I have with my own children. That would be, and it's one thing to have an interest in and to be evaluating relationships from a young age. It's probably another one to develop a very finely tuned, I guess, if I can be so bold as to say that, but technique, I guess, for entering into the world of another person and experiencing their world in a way that is not intrusive, not experienced as intrusive, but is rather experienced as safe. And I think this is one of the aspects of the therapeutic work that I do is that I'm able to enter the world of the young person not as an intruder, but as someone who they experience as being safe and acknowledging and validating of their experience, and so that they take from that experience the kernel of a belief that relationships can be satisfying, can be safe and satisfying, but more importantly that they're a person of worth. They matter. Their experience matters. They matter, and I think the gift that I've had is that I have then raised my children not to any timetables, not according to what society tells me I should do in the way I should, but rather I raised them with sensitivity and deep acknowledgement and validation of their experience and responsiveness to that. And I think so. I learned a lot as a parent from the work that I do. And I was always, when I was growing up, I was fascinated in other cultures and other countries. I remember I used to have this book that had come from either my mother or one of her siblings that was about Africa and safaris. And before I even read, I used to pore over that book. And so I was always really interested in other cultures and other countries. So I've been able to travel as well. Whether that I've been able to, I guess, building things that are meaningful to other people through my writing, and that has allowed me to travel a little bit as part of my work, which is fantastic. I love it.
That's amazing. And if anyone wants to find Colby to talk through anything with him, I'm sure he is very easy to find. He's an author. He's on LinkedIn. Colby Pearce. It's quite an unusual name. You'll find him. Just Google him. I won't patronize everybody with links to things because you're easy to find. Listen, it's been really great talking to you. There's lots of synergy stuff. There's a really lovely overlap with things, and then there's the places where we go into very different places and spaces, but you know, that core stuff around relationships, around belonging, around identity, place, worthiness, all of that stuff is really important to me. So it's been really lovely to talk to you. Thank you so much. And I will hopefully speak to you soon.
Yes, that would be grand. Maybe when I'm in your neck of the woods.
Yeah.
Whenever that may be.
Yes, and equally when I'm back in Australia, I will come and find you. I think I did try last time, but Australia's a big country. It's quite tricky.
It is. Yeah. All right then. Well, thank you very much.
Take care.
Thank you.